So in the first 3 years of running, we are laying the foundation of this connective tissue. And this can be one of the reasons why static stretching, these long hold positions and trying to force long static mobility can ultimately be really problematic for injury because we're reducing the efficiency of that elastic transfer in the connective tissue. If we do our plyometric training effectively, we start to actually get the connective tissue to look like little coils, little zigzags, so that they are spring-loaded and they transfer force efficiently. This is going to make it so you don't actually have as high of a muscular demand on the system, meaning you don't need to use as much oxygen when you're running, meaning you're going to be able to run a lot faster before you get gassed and out of breath. Welcome to the Doc Wishloff Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirsten Wishloff. On today's episode, we are talking about preventing injuries this running season. So if you are a runner and you got some big plans for the summer, the spring, the fall, this is the episode for you. Listen up. We're going to prevent those injuries. I've worked with runners for a really, really long time. I myself was a runner. I have a love-hate relationship with running, a little more on the hate side. I was a soccer player. I played a pretty high level of soccer, and well, you run a lot. You run a lot as a soccer player. And so I feel like in my adult life, with free choice, I've reduced my amount of running. That being said, I do run a running club, host a running club in the spring called the Postpartum Pacers out of my clinic, the Athletes Grid in Toronto. And we got a season coming up in the spring here. It's completely free to join. The reason I started this running club was because postpartum, I had a really hard time running. And I wanted some support. So I created a running club for ladies just looking to get, $3K in your pocket postpartum, just gain some confidence and have a little bit of professional advice when you are returning to run. Make sure you're doing it safely, keeping that pelvic floor in mind. I digress. We're talking about running injuries in general. If you guys are interested in me chatting about running postpartum, shoot me a message and I'll make an episode on it. Probably be a good episode. But we're going to talk about regular old runners, not specifically postpartum today. We're going to talk about preventing injuries in your body as a runner. Sports are very interesting because they come with kind of this folklore that is passed down from generation to generation. You have your coach that did it this way, who learned it from their coach who did it that way, who learned it from this great elite athlete who won whatever race. And that was how they did it. And we kind of extrapolate out training plans from that. Now, there's nothing wrong with that strategy. However, sometimes what works for one person doesn't work for everyone. In the world of science, and when we're talking about injury prevention, we have come leaps and bounds when it comes to the research of tendon injuries over the past 15 years. And so sometimes this folklore of what works for injury prevention is kind of just that. It's this folklore and it's kind of the comfort level, and you get this fear of changing from the cultural norms of the sport because you're like, well, if so-and-so did it and they did really good in the race, if I don't stretch or if I don't strengthen my glutes, I will never be an elite runner. I should do exactly what everybody else did. So I get the fear around, digressing from the normal flow and plan and things that you've heard as a runner. But we're going to take some not crazy controversial takes, but a little bit of controversy. We're going to talk about why this phenomenon of just glute strength maybe is a little bit problematic. We're also going to talk about why stretching ultimately is probably playing a smaller role in your injuries than you think. And I'm going to give you some suggestions based on what I've learned working with athletes over my time as a therapist and as someone who has experienced some tendon-based injuries, what I've experienced personally, and wrap that into a little bow, bob it in an episode for you today. So I got a couple categories that I'm going to work my way through. The very first thing I'm going to want you to do as you're listening to this, if you're thinking through your own running season or your own running injuries, I want you to kind of put yourself into one of two categories, beginner or experienced. In my mind, a beginner runner would fall into the category of within the first 1 to 3 years of running. So maybe you've done one season, maybe it's your first season, but you're still relatively early in the big picture of connective tissue adaptation for sport. Once you're over that 3-year period, you've had this chance for your connective tissue to adapt to the forces of running. I know that sounds crazy because when we think about strength, we usually think about muscle strength, and muscle strength usually takes 6 to 8 weeks to start to grow and change these adaptations. From a muscle perspective, yes, we can continue to layer on strength. We can continue to layer on endurance, especially when we're talking about an endurance sport, right? That type of adaptation can really layer in over time. But ultimately, muscular strength and endurance is a smaller piece of the puzzle within that first little bit versus connective tissue strength. When we're thinking about connective tissue strength and running, we're thinking about plyometrics. Connective tissue, and when I say connective tissue, I kind of mean like ligaments, cartilage, tendons, and specifically kind of tendons in this instance, or even fascia. It changes its presentation as we train it in certain ways. Fascia, ligaments, if you long hold static stretch them for a long period of time, the fibers themselves start to get longer and straighter. So you're going to get this length, but what we actually want is spring. That's going to create the efficiency. If we've trained these fibers in this long stretch, static position, they're not really efficient at transmitting force. So what we actually want to start to get a shape of within our connective tissue or tendons is this kinking pattern. And that's been studied when we're looking at training fascia and training tendons, is that if we do our plyometric training effectively, we start to actually get the connective tissue to look like little coils, little zigzags, so that they are spring-loaded and they transfer force efficiently. This is going to make it so you don't actually have as high of a muscular demand on the system, meaning you don't need to use as much oxygen when you're running, meaning you're going to be able to run a lot faster before you get gassed and out of breath. So in the first 3 years of running, we are laying the foundation of this connective tissue. And this can be one of the reasons why static stretching, these long hold positions and trying to force long static mobility can ultimately be really problematic for injury, because we're reducing the efficiency of that elastic transfer in the connective tissue. So when we are thinking about training as a beginner, we want to think about elasticity, strength in the feet, strength in the connective tissue. And predominantly that becomes exercises in plyometrics with a big emphasis on the capacity to utilize the arch of your foot. The arch of your foot dictates how efficient your hip muscles are. Yeah? That foot rolling up and down is the process that we go through in the gait cycle, and that's how we utilize our glute. So this takes me, I know we're already hitting all the hits early. This takes me to this thought of like always just isolated strengthening your glutes. If your foot cannot effectively transmit force off the ground, you will not be able to take that glute strength and utilize it within your running practice. So it is not, problematic to be strong. That's great. Strengthen your glutes. But if you're not using your foot effectively into the ground, your glute is not going to work efficiently. So that means you're strengthening your glute. You're doing all this work outside of sport. And then when you transfer into sport, you're not even utilizing the strength that you've got because your foot can't move. Little biomechanics lesson for you. That foot needs to be able to rotate. Arch needs to be able to come up and down in order for your glute to work efficiently and shorten and lengthen. So this is a little package. We're talking beginner runners. We're talking about improving connective tissue elasticity. We're talking about the utilization of your foot and trying to shape your training to elicit adaptation in connective tissue. So it doesn't always mean you're going to be gassed. It doesn't always mean we're pushing you to the absolute threshold when it comes to cardiovascular work. It means we're trying to get your connective tissue to come along for that adaptation ride and start working more efficiently so that when we go to stress that cardiovascular system, we're not ending up with connective tissue injuries. So this is kind of our beginner category. Let's talk about experienced runners, because when we talk through, creating a season for an experienced runner, we want to start to look at the history of your seasons. I've worked with lots of different runners who've had different coaches, and different coaches have different training styles, and you can start to see what training style is sitting positively within your body. If you've only ever worked with one coach or you've only ever used one training strategy and you're a couple years down the road and you're feeling like you're plateauing, it might be a time to change up the strategy. Maybe more speed work, less distance, or maybe we're talking about lower, threshold capacity, but we're changing that impact on your body to see if we're going to break through that plateau. This is generally the first thing that I suggest when clients are experiencing more chronic types injuries as an experienced runner. Different bodies at different times need different stresses to elicit adaptation. So if you've been doing the same old programming again and again, and you're using the same strategy, it might be time to change it up. That's generally what I would say as a starting point, whether you're staying with your existing coach and we're creating a different style of plan, or we're changing coaches to use a different style. This usually is my first suggestion when we're talking about an experienced runner who's kind of hitting either a plateau in their race speed or a plateau just regarding injury. So changing up the force, again, as an experienced runner, yes, we can always be, nudging up that connective tissue threshold and working through that. But there's going to be a much bigger component as to creating adaptations within your cardiovascular system. And that's going to mean changing how we stress it and changing how we recover it. So this is what I would say kind of the difference between beginner and experienced is. Beginner, you got to get boots on the ground. You got to get that connective tissue adapting. And as an experienced runner, we have to start looking at how to make just little tweaks in how we stress the system to elicit the adaptations we're looking for. Your body is changing year over year, day over day. The adaptations that, maybe when you were 25 and you were running, you were having really good results from a particular training style. But maybe you're 35, 40, and now that training style is not recovering, right? Your body doesn't recover the same. It's different. It's a different body. So we have to be open to the idea that what worked 5 to 8 years ago maybe isn't the ideal plan for you today. So whatever category you fall into, think through that because it's going to make a difference in how you experience injury and how you should map out your season. The next thing we're going to talk about as just kind of like a broad statement, but we're going to talk about what does recovery kind of mean when we're talking about soreness or stiffness within your body. A lot of people think I need to stretch more, I should foam roll more, like this will solve all of my problems. The very first thing we want to think about when we are trying to recover effectively from a tough running session is nutrition and sleep. Nutrition and sleep. When you sleep, your body is actually like recovering, right? When you work out or when you run, you're breaking down your body with the intent of signaling an adaptation. If your body has the building blocks, meaning the nutritional and the mechanics is working, your digestive system is working. If we have the nutrients and our digestive system is working and we are getting optimal amounts of sleep, your body is actually going to have a chance to do the adaptation you have asked of it. If we are running and we're not getting sufficient sleep or we're under eating or we're getting insufficient minerals, electrolytes, you're not going to have this adaptation. And generally what that'll show up as is stiffness because your body isn't able to build the strength that it needs to kind of gain the muscle you're asking it to gain. So stiffness is kind of a default setting of, I don't think I can do this. Your nervous system being like, whoa, this muscle is getting used a lot. And maybe we're not strong enough to do what you're asking. So I'm going to create more stiffness here. The thought is if we're sufficiently providing nutrients and sleep, your body is actually going to have less stiffness overall. We'll lump hydration into that as well. But that's really the first step, especially when we're having like a generalized stiffness through the body, which is surprising to some because I think, you get this message like you're stiff, you got to stretch it out. Stretch it out. If you're stiff, you need to sleep. And you need to get enough nutrition. And if you're getting enough sleep and you're getting enough nutrition and you're still experiencing a ton of stiffness, your training volumes might be too high for the capacity of your tissue. So then at that point, the question becomes, do I need to, get stronger so this tissue doesn't get so stiff? That's probably another consideration as well. If we're thinking about adding things like stretching or adding things like foam rolling, I want you to have this thought in the back of your mind that we are trying to flush nutrients. So foam rolling shouldn't be used to attack your body. It should be used to flush fluid and bring motion to tissue. I know y'all are treating it like a way to just grapple with the frustration of tightness or stiffness or pain in your body. It's not really, you can elicit a muting of pain through sensory like pressure. But really what we want to be thinking of is flushing fluid. We're providing this tissue with an opportunity to flush oxygen, to flush nutrients, to recover. Us, even as therapists, us manually working on tissue, we're really changing the feedback from the nervous system and we're bringing blood flow. I can't change how your metabolism works by, dry needling your calf. I can elicit a change in how your nervous system is holding tension and we can bring blood flow, but we need to ensure that you are having this kind of system of recovery optimized with nutrition, first before we continue to kind of attack tissue. If always the same stuff is getting stiff and sore, and again, a flag for me in terms of like, is this a problem of recovery or is this a problem of movement, is it symmetry, right? Is this happening the same on one side versus the other? Or do you have shin splints on the left and nothing on the right? The recovery practices are gonna, yes, be important, but they're gonna not be as important when we're dealing with something that's asymmetrical in nature. So that's ultimately what we kind of want to categorize. So in saying that, what would be a broad recommendation for how much to stretch or how much to foam roll as a runner? My recommendation would change based on your capacity to like sleep and eat in a good way. Put that at a higher priority. If you have, X amount of energy in a week, put a lot more energy into creating time to sleep and eat than creating time to stretch. That's what I would say. There's nothing that's wrong with stretching. What I would probably say is stretching should be used to offset static positions you might be finding in your life. So as an athlete, I played soccer in university, played volleyball too, but essentially the worst my body ever felt would be when I would stress it and then sit in a desk. That's going to change how your tissue is actually healing. So the more diversity you can get in your motion when your body is in that recovery phase. So we stress the system, we worked out. When we think about how our body is recovering, the more neutral of a position you can find yourself in, the more neutral the adaptation is going to be. This is often why people will get really tight hamstrings, is they stress the system, they work out, and then they sit at a desk through the day. And it basically elicits the adaptation of shortening in the posterior chain side of the body. So the more we can do standing, the more we can do walking, the more diversity you can get within your movements outside of your activity when we're stressing it, the better the adaptation is going to be within your connective tissue. If you have the ability to do that, like get up and walk more than you're sitting, do it. If you don't, this is probably when I would put in some stretching or mobility work to offset the position you're finding yourself in outside of sport. I'm going to put a little asterisk too, not asterisk, a little bonus, little note at the bottom here. A lot of people ask me about, should I get a massage gun? Same thing. Lymphatic, pain relief, bringing some blood flow to the connective tissue. Perfect. Is it going to make or break an injury? Probably not. As soon as you have something that is asymmetrical in your body, you're like, my left hip's always tight or my right foot's always tight, get a biomechanical assessment done. I can help you with that. Put some stuff in the show notes, some information for you. I'll talk about it at the end, but we want to figure out why that's occurring, because the area where forces are accumulating is the area doing a lot of work. There's probably somewhere else in the system that is not moving enough, and it's creating the overload site at that foot. So we can't just have a productive intervention at the site of pain. Next point on the list is talking about rotation. For all of time, through my training in university, after university, everyone talks about how running is such a sagittal plane motion. Yes, your body is physically moving forward. Sagittal plane means forward and backwards. However, you are rolling through these coils of rotation to create a sagittal plane motion. Running is inherently rotational. It is not a sagittal motion when you look at the system working together. Yes, your arms are moving forward and back, but they're opposing each other. So we're creating these coils of rotation. The way your foot contacts the ground through a gait cycle is we extend out, we plant our foot. Your foot should roll into pronation. Pronation's not bad. It's part of the gait cycle. As your foot rolls into pronation, what ends up happening is we coil your hip into internal rotation. Internal rotation at your hip, this is at mid-stand. So we have pronation, and we're curling that hip into internal rotation. When we come to push off the ground, that's called toe off, the extension of your big toe snaps the rest of the system into external rotation. This is where your glute comes in. If your foot has not effectively coiled into internal rotation, when you go to push off, you're not going to effectively be able to utilize your glute. This is what's happening in the leg, but when we look up the torso, your rib cage and shoulders are opposing this motion. If they are not opposing the motion, the efficiency of that force transfer isn't going to happen. So inefficiency in the ability to move your rib cage or your shoulders or your neck is going to show up as Achilles tendon pain or shin splints or big toe pain or hamstring pain. So much of the running world gets focused on lower limb problems, but oftentimes this reciprocal motion that's happening up in the rib cage is creating the overload sites down below. And also how one side of your body pushes off directly influences how the other side is planting. So we can't look at a running injury in isolation. We can't look at a shin splint and be like, oh, I'm going to rub your shin, do some calf raises, see you later. I know that's how running injuries are managed in the bulk of the world. I dig a little bit deeper because I had a lot of those injuries that kind of got dismissed as local problems, but they were more of a big picture problem. I think in order to have a successful intervention, especially when we're talking about activities that are so repetitive in nature, we have to look at how the movement is flowing through the system, and especially within rotation, because that's so much of what running is. If we are talking about other types of injuries, like if we're totally zoomed out of the running world and maybe we're in a field, so like we're in soccer or we're in football and you roll your ankle and it's an isolated instant, it's not as important to look through the entirety of the system, especially in the short term. Maybe when we're trying to re-loop stuff back together in the back half of the rehab, but that's a one-time force that's creating an overload. Let's rehab the ankle, no biggie. But when we're talking about an injury that's coming from the accumulation of force from running and like those strides happening again and again and again, if we don't look at the biomechanics of what's creating the conditions for that area to become injured, and we just keep trying to focalize strength at the site of pain, you have a really precarious solution. And this is what I often see when people get treated for running injuries is, your knee hurts, let's strengthen your glutes. So you do 2 months of like as much glute strength as you humanly possibly can. And you're like, you know what? My knee feels a lot better. The glute strength helped my knee. You're like, great. This is great. It's not a problem, but it's precarious because as soon as you stop doing that excessive amount of glute strength, the exact same injury returns because we haven't identified the source of the problem. So if we're talking about just doing glute strength in isolation, we haven't looked at how the foot is actually connecting and transferring force off the ground. Suddenly that glute strength is always going down because you're not using your glute the way it was intended to functionally transfer force forward. So I don't have an issue with isolated strength exercises as isolated, directed towards the site of pain. But these are such precarious solutions because you need to be doing so much of that exercise in order to just stay afloat, right? We're not making progress. We're just staying sub-symptom, right? We're just getting past that threshold of not being hurt. And we're holding on by like a thread of how many glute bridges and clamshells you can do in a day. There's nothing wrong with those exercises, but up until the point we've figured out how the glute is activating within the system, you're always going to be kind of a victim to keeping those glutes as like a crutch, essentially, for an inability to flow movement more evenly through the system. Okay, short-term solution, really exhausting long-term solution, extremely problematic if you're an elite athlete and that injury is actually the piece stopping you from progressing to the next level. This is generally where I find people, they're like, I've had this injury forever, I tried the usual things, help me. That's when we're going to zoom out and take a really big picture approach and start to really get down to the bottom of what's going on. But isolated interventions are really good for traumatic injuries. Isolated interventions are not so great for atraumatic injuries that are occurring as the result of how you move. So think about that when you're choosing your exercises. When we are working with runners, we have our training club through the athlete's grid, lots and lots of rotation, lots and lots of foot strength, and lots of glute activation within closed chain, within your foot contacting the ground, because that is how we're going to use it when we are running. And the last piece is treatment. How do you get treatment as a runner? What should you get treatment on? I know that dry needling is a very popular intervention for a lot of things. I know that there's a lot of thoughts about like massage and stripping away tension. My first, and if you guys have been listening to this podcast at all, my first recommendation would be don't think of tension as an attack. Think of it as a strategy of support. So we can certainly take out some of the tension in your body, but we want to understand that if it's happening again in an asymmetrical way, maybe that tension is doing something for you. Maybe your body is signaling that this area is having an excessive amount of force going through it for what it can handle. Same thing for dry needling, right? We're plugging away. We're trying to get that muscle to twitch and release. It's not problematic. In the grand scheme of things, your body's adaptable. We can deal. But we do want to understand that if you're going every single week, 3 times a week, whatever the case is, just to get your calves released, and you're like, my calves are so tight. My brain goes, why are your calves doing so much? Why isn't your hip doing more? Why isn't your lower back getting sore? Why is it only accumulating here? Because if we can transfer that force to flow more evenly, maybe we don't have to get your calves released of the time, right? So a zillion times a week, and kind of have this reactive response. So the thought of treatment in terms of maintenance is productive, so long as there's this kind of bigger thought process going on as to like why that is occurring. Just because to blindly continue to strip out tension without identifying patterns that are problematic, you're going to walk yourself towards a larger injury later. In some instances, right? I don't want to say that for everything, but it can be an indication of overload points that are starting to accumulate in your body. When I'm treating someone who's doing repetitive styles of activity, you can map out these tension lines and really figure out where these people are flowing their movement. And you can also feel where you're missing tension. And we want to make sure that we're also addressing those areas instead of just attacking tension. We really want to start to find the areas that are sitting quietly and not quite doing enough and try to bring them as part of the team. Because when we bring more to support the system and the flow of movement, the tightness and the stuff doing too much actually goes down. I know these are some hot takes. Hopefully this reframes your mindset around running injuries. I do have a free webinar that I put together for you guys. I'm going to link it in the show notes. So this is a snippet from my program, The Runner's Revival. It's an 8-week program, so you can learn about your body, learn about how to take care of it, and start to identify some of those biomechanical reasons for overload and why those sites of injury are happening. It's a really great little program. There's a perfectly, little packaged clip for you guys. I think it's about like 20 minutes, half hour long, but it's a really great clip to get you reframing how you're thinking about these running injuries. I know there's a lot of the cultural thoughts of running, of like strengthen your glutes and stretch more and all that jazz, but I would really encourage you to take that one extra step to start to perceive how these problems are showing up a little bit differently, because then you can choose a more effective intervention and you can get a lot further in your running career, have a lot more of an enjoyable season instead of feeling like you're always whack-a-moling injuries down and chasing them around with a foam roller. I would love you to have a season where you predicted where movement is flowing and you were able to manage any sort of overload you were experiencing before it blew up your season. So that is it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed chatting about running injuries today. As always, shoot me a message if you have any questions and head to the show notes and check out that free webinar. Have a good one.